Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. So today we are quilting our Tree of Life block, and as you can see, I have stitched it with undulation. This is my absolute favorite design, and it's basically just really messy echoes. And I left a lot of space between these lines so that way the block finishes nice and soft. So let's get a game plan and start quilting undulation over this super scrappy tree block together. So I had an idea for block 3, and that is to use my new favorite undulation design and to run that up and through the tree and kind of split it on both sides. But I realized it would probably work best if I did some sort of marking. So I'm just going to kind of run up with a line, kind of curve it around, and then bring it down, something like that. So I'm going to curve up and in and then back down, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Try not to make it too symmetrical. Curve it around and bring it down. And the idea is, now that I have almost a foundation idea in place, now all I need to do is stitch that line going this way and stitch the line going this way, and then fill in those areas with more repeated lines of echo quilting. Undulation is messy echoes. It's intentionally improper echoes. And so the idea is to get closer together and further apart and make it really random and flowy. And I think that's going to look great over this tree. Now, of course, you might be looking at this going, oh, please, please, please don't do that. You know, you're quilting all over all these half square triangles. Please understand that there's a million different ways you can quilt every single block. And I want to give you some different ideas that accent the shape of a block, but don't necessarily pay attention to every single pieced line. In this case, stitching in the ditch around every single half square triangle will result in really dense quilting that'll actually feel pretty stiff, but it's also really time consuming. So doing undulation in this pattern, I think is going to be faster, it's going to be easier, and I think it's going to be gorgeous. So I'm going to get my block basted up, ready to go, and we're going to quilt undulation over our Tree of Life block. So I'm on my machine, and let's go over our settings. I've got a normal straight stitch with the needle in the center position, and I'm going to dial my stitch length down to 0. What this does is it basically stops the feed dogs from moving. The feed dogs are the little teeth underneath your foot that feed your fabric forward. Well, personally, I don't like to drop my feed dogs because I find that sometimes messes with the tension on my machine. I don't get as good a looking stitches. So I just lower my stitch length here to 0 instead, and then I cover the feed dogs with this queen size Supreme slider. It's nice and big, and this just helps my quilt glide and slide easily over the surface. This area will get chewed up just a little bit because the feed dogs are still bouncing up and down, but I've been using this particular slider for over a year and it's still in great shape, so it's nothing to really worry about. I do have a darning foot on my machine here, and this one I've modified, and I have another video tutorial if you'd like to learn how to modify your darning foot with a rubber band and break the toe open. This is just a really inexpensive darning foot here. Then you can learn how to do that. Check it out at leahday.com/darn. That's where you can find it. Okay, I'm gonna roll up the block here and get started. And I'm gonna kind of guesstimate maybe about half of an inch off the edge of this block. I don't really need to quilt beyond that. Make sure my foot is in the down position. Sometimes with a darning foot, it's kind of hard to tell if your foot is in the up or down position. So always double check that. Just reach back and feel that little bar and make sure that your foot is in the down position. Okay, what did I just do there? I pulled my bobbin thread up to the quilt surface, and I want to go slow so that way you understand how to do this. I'm going to drop the foot down. I'm going to drop the needle down using the hand wheel on the machine. I'm going to give that top thread a little tug. That pulls up a loop. That loop is your bobbin thread. Now, if you ever try this and then your top thread won't pull up, and that bobbin thread, it just feels stuck, that means you haven't made a full rotation. You need to continue to rotate your needle until it makes a full pass through the bobbin area. That was something that really hung me up for a long time, and I kept getting confused. Why won't my bobbin thread come up? And that was why. Okay, so I've got my line marked, And I'm just basically going to try and quilt right along that, and always ending with the needle in the down position. This means that I might have to rustle the block up quite a bit. I'm going to pull back so that way you can see what I'm doing here with the block. I'm going to have to just roll it up and kind of move it here so it's right in front of the machine. And I need it to be rustled up like that so that way I can easily move it as I'm pushing the whole block, everything through the arm of the machine in order to make these stitches. And free motion quilting, this is the big thing about it. You are producing the stitches completely yourself. If I take my hands off of it and I continue to stitch, you can see that block isn't moving. It's not going anywhere. So I have to be pushing the block. And when I'm pushing it, that speed of my hands moving in time with the speed of the machine running is what is producing my stitches. And right now I can tell you my stitches are kind of all over the place. They're getting a little bit big and a little bit small and a little bit big again, because I'll be honest, I'm kind of out of the habit of free motion quilting on my home machine. I haven't been doing a lot of it lately. I've been doing a lot more ruler foot quilting, which is a style of free motion quilting, yes, but at the same time, it's just a little different because you've got the ruler in your hand and that kind of changes things a little bit. So yeah, I need to work on this. I obviously need to get on the machine and just do some plain Jane free motion quilting here too. All right, so now I'm coming around. And I actually started this the opposite of what I was planning. I was planning on coming up the tree and then around the leaves, and I just realized I actually came around the opposite, and my foot is getting hung up right here. Let me show you. So this can happen sometimes. Your foot is designed to hover, but even still, when the quilt is particularly thick, it can get gummed up a little bit. Basically, it's just hitting up against that foot and it's stopping. So I just need to focus on that and just make sure that I've got a good grip on the quilt. I don't want to shove it through and suddenly get a big giant stitch, but I do want to make sure that I don't get stuck and stitch in place for too many stitches. If you stitch in place with free motion quilting, you'll get what's called a hesitation knot. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a little knot on the back of your quilt, and it's basically where you're hesitating. Maybe you're thinking about the design, you're thinking about where you're stitching next, and a knot will appear, sometimes on the front, usually on the back of your quilt. So watch out for that. Whenever your machine stops or your hands stop moving, make sure to stop your machine dead, so that way you're not producing more stitches and just stitching in place. Okay, I've got a pretty nice straight shot here. I'm gonna just wiggle on down. I am noticing whenever I hit those places where I have lots of seam allowances all in one place, it is definitely hanging up that foot. So it's something I need to think about and maybe avoid those spots in the future. Okay, take out another pen and pen more. I like to baste my quilt blocks with straight pens and pen mores just so that way they're really easy to take out of the block as I go. And because we're quilting basically off the edge of the block, I can just break thread here. I don't need to tie off and bury these thread tails because that's off the edge of the block. We're going to go around this with a victory lap once all of the blocks are done, so I don't feel like I really need to tie off and bury that. All right, let's talk about the major advantage of free motion quilting versus walking foot quilting, because this is a simple enough design. It's just a curvy, simple line that you could quilt this with walking foot style quilting. So why do you want to do it with free motion quilting? Well, the advantage is right here. You can see I'm quilting this backwards. I'm pulling the block towards me, and a walking foot can't do this. When you're walking foot quilting, you always have to continually rotate the quilt or the block around so that the direction you're quilting in is what you're facing. But with free motion quilting, I can quilt here kind of at the diagonal. Let me see if this is the one thing though. Yes, you can quilt in all directions, but I can't promise you it's going to feel very comfortable. That's the downside. And if it doesn't feel very comfortable to quilt, you're probably not going to produce the best looking stitches. So just keep that in mind. On paper, yes, you should be theoretically, a lot of caveats there. On paper, theoretically, you should be able to quilt in all directions. However, depending on how that feels, how comfortable that feels, and also depending on what your sewing machine likes. Some sewing machines really don't tolerate stitching backwards the direction that you saw me stitching in right at the beginning there with that new line of quilting. So keep that in mind. If you suddenly start breaking thread, or your thread shreds or splits, those are all signs that that might not be a direction that your sewing machine particularly likes to quilt in. And it is possible to, kind of stitch around that, basically just try and avoid that direction. It does take practice, and it's not going to be a simple process. This is definitely something where to get those nice, beautiful, even stitches, it's kind of a riding a bicycle kind of thing. It does take practice. Okay, so I've kind of got my foundation set now. I'm so excited. This is looking great. And so now all I've got to do is echo these lines and create that cool undulation effect. So that's what I'm going to go for now. I think I'm going to stitch out and create a nice wide gap between these lines. And like I said, this area, we've got extra here in this outer strip on our block. And so I've got extra space here. So I feel like I can quilt, a 1/4 inch from the edge of the block, even a 1/2 inch away from the block. That's not all going to get cut off whenever we go to connect our blocks together. So it's no worries there. I can avoid some thread breaks and some long thread tails by just simply stitching over and then going into my block design. There we go. I'm going to bring my lines in close. I'm kind of working my way up the tree trunk, and I'll probably only stitch 2 lines, maybe actually only even 1 line up this tree trunk, just so that way the block doesn't get too dense. I don't want this to get, so much quilting that it becomes stiff. And particularly this tree trunk area, if I stitch too many times up that area, it'll definitely start to get too much quilting. All right, so I'm going to come in and swing around this way. I think that's the best path. So let's see here. Yeah, I might do 1 more line of quilting up the tree trunk, just so that way I have an even number. I have 1 swinging out to the left and 1 swinging out to the right. And I'll be honest, I am making this up completely as I go. And this is a-okay. This is what I want you to see when you're doing this quilt along, is that it's okay to make up designs and just put it on your quilt and have some fun. I'm erasing that line now, kind of my messy marked line, so that way I can see my quilting line. And I want to start making this more like undulation and less like just evenly echoed lines. I want to bring that line down and nice and close right here. So that's what I'm aiming for. And I am continually getting my foot kind of hung up on those seam allowances. So I might actually stop after a few lines here and switch feet and see if that helps. So I've switched out to a different darning foot, and this one is actually included in our deluxe foot set for the Eversewn Sparrow 20. And what I've noticed is I don't actually have to modify this foot. It sets up a little higher, and then I didn't modify it, so it is going to bounce. But I found with this particular foot, it doesn't bug me. So, this is just one of those things that you can change up. On the cheaper foot that I sell on my site, that's the one that I was using before. I do modify that, but as you can see, it's not always perfect. I was having a lot of trouble with that foot hitting up against these seams. This foot still has a little bar that is hitting every time the needle comes up, and it's hitting that bar. That's what's causing it to hop. But for some reason, I don't know whether it's the wide base or it's just the way it's designed, it doesn't bug me as much as it used to. And that nice wide base gives me great visibility over my needle. So for those 2 reasons, I think it's just working out better over these bulky seams. I'm going to remember this in the future because we've got a lot of bulky seams in these blocks. Okay, so now I'm swinging around and we're going to head back down this tree trunk again. And I want to be careful to not get too close to my lines of quilting, but also kind of aim for stitching more or less in the middle of the gap that I've got open. It's kind of the idea, just kind of fill in that gap, but then also continue the design nicely. And it's okay if you leave some spaces open. Just want to continue that nice undulation design. There we go. Oh man, this is like quilting butter now. It's so much easier whenever I got a foot that works. There we go. Now we're going to come down, and I think I want to do something a little bit more interesting than what I stitched before. And this is the key with undulation. When it starts to get boring, That lets you know you got to shake it up and do something a little different. Add a little extra wiggle wobble in there and then make it more interesting. Okay, so we've kind of got our foundation set. We've filled in our tree trunk completely. And so now we basically have three separate spaces on this quilt block. Actually 4. We've got this area around the tree base. We've got this pocket here to the left of the tree, a pocket here to the right of the tree, and then this top area. This is the biggest space. So let me show you how we're going to fill in all of these areas. It's all the exact same. I'm going to work down here since I'm already down here. All I'm going to do is just messy echoes. So I'm going to come in. I'm just continuing with that undulation design. I want to come in nice and close. And I also want to spread out and go far away too. I'm going to come up to a point here because I think that'll look the best. Now I'm going to stitch right back and do a messy echo on that other side. So let me rotate things around so I can really see what I'm doing. And again, if you want to mix it up and make it more interesting, just make that line a lot more curvy than the one before. That's the nice thing about undulation, is you can always mix it up. Now I'm going to come back, and this is going to be even crazier. I think I'm going to come in, I'm going to get nice and close right here, then spread out nice and wide right here, and then I'm not going to hit that. There's a seam allowance right there. I don't want to hit that, so I want to watch out for that one. Okay, so let's concentrate on all of those things at once. Come in nice and close. Now spread out far and wide. Now come in again. Whenever it feels uncomfortable, like you've stitched beyond the space of your hands, stop and reposition your hands. Quilting on your home machine is always a start-stop process because you only have that space between your thumb and forefingers, just like that. That's as far as I can quilt comfortably. So once you move beyond that, you really have to stop and shift things around. All right. Notice that I'm not coming in too deep on these lines. I'm really staying nice far apart. When I come in, I do get, some of these lines I've spaced them out and brought these lines like a 1/4 inch apart. But for the most part, overall, this is being quilted on at least a 1/2, if not an inch wide scale. And this is the other cool thing that you can do with undulation, is that you can bring certain areas, like this area, I think of this like the roots, you can make this ever so slightly denser than the areas of openness here on the sides of the tree. And I think that will even look better too. We'll try that out. I'm going to stitch down. I've only got a few more lines here to stitch. Oh man, I'm loving this. It's really delightful, I gotta say, whenever I have an idea and then it really exceeds my expectations. And this definitely has. It's exceeded my expectations on how pretty this texture is turning out. And I love that contrast. I'm using Isacord sterling thread over this block, and I'm loving that contrast. Okay, so like I said, we can vary how far apart our lines are. Roughly right now, I'm on about a 1/2 inch scale. That's a 1/2 inch between these lines of quilting. And on some of our other blocks, we've been a little bit more open than that, so you might start being concerned that this one's going to end up more dense than the others. So for these lines, in this kind of background area, let's try and have those be generally wider apart. And if you can't visualize it, grab a marking pen and mark it. This is absolutely allowed. I never want you to feel like it's illegal or somehow makes you a bad quilter or a cheater to grab a marking pencil. I gotta say, I always keep a marking pencil right next to my machine for exactly this reason. When I can't visualize it or I'm afraid, because I've already set kind of a base of this scale, I will naturally continue quilting that densely. That's just how my brain works. So unless I get some marks on this quilt, that's what I'm going to continue to do. So what I'm doing is I'm focusing on certain areas, like that pocket right there and that pocket right there, where I'm allowed to come in and get close. But then everywhere else, I'm focusing on staying wider out, staying wider apart. So that way we have less quilting, the quilt will be softer, and bonus, it's faster to finish. Because, you know, if you have the distance between, you know, 1/2 inch scale and 1 inch scale, you have to do half as much quilting. You know, that's cutting the amount of quilting time you're doing in half. So of course it's going to be faster. Okay, got one more line. And you might be feeling like, oh, well, you know, I'm losing that pretty texture, you know, that gorgeous undulation texture. And this is the kind of trade-off that we always have to do with every single quilting design. The denser you bring those lines, the more your quilting design is going to stand out and show off. The more you're going to get that punch of powerful texture. But the more time it takes and the more dense your quilt's going to feel, so it's not going to be a bed quilt anymore. So it's kind of a, you know, it is a trade-off. But I think that this many lines, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of quilting. I think this is going to be plenty. I think it's going to look great too. So this is just an example of sometimes when I'm, you know, kind of powering through something and I'm like, I really want to change my scale. This is what I do. I grab my marking pencil. I change that scale by marking it on the quilt. And it doesn't matter if I decide to go off those lines. Like, let's say I just decide, hey, I don't really want to hit that point. I'm going to veer off a little bit more. That's okay, because guess what? Those lines will erase out. You won't ever know that I meant to quilt further down because it's gone. You know, this is all in my head. This is all just temporary lines. And then once they're gone, you'll never know that I meant to quilt something different. Okay, so this is pretty simple at this point, and it feels easier too. If ever you're struggling to kind of get the hang of all the different things of free motion quilting, we are doing a lot of different things at once. We're operating the machine, and we're listening to the machine sound. And then we're also pushing the quilt through the arm of the machine, and we're thinking of the design at the same time and focusing on the quilt and trying not to do things like stitch pleats in the quilt, you know, keep our stitches the same size and shape and, you know, not make a mistake. So we're trying to do so many different things at once, and having marked lines can be such a relief because then you don't have to think about the design too. All you have to do is just simply aim to quilt on that marked line. If you don't hit it, if you're not perfect at it, it doesn't matter. It's going to go away. So that's not the end of the world. You have basically it's kind of like you have a guideline to follow, but it's okay if you don't follow it. But it's giving you some idea of what you're doing, of what your path is. So this is something that I think is really key. And in a lot of our past quilt-alongs, I've provided marked templates so you can mark every line on your block. Didn't do that with Friendship for 2 reasons. The first is we have way too many seam allowances. And these Friendship blocks, you know, if you tried to mark a design through all these seam allowances of all these half square triangles, you wouldn't get anywhere because you wouldn't be able to see anything through the block, you know, using a light box or something like that. It's just impossible. So that was a major reason why I just decided that we would not mark the designs, and then also that the quilting is a mystery, and I'm doing this really block by block as I go, and able to explore and try out new ideas as they come, like this undulation design. You know, I didn't even think of this design 4 or 5 months ago when I was planning the blocks. So in that way, I think this is really working out well, and it's a lot of fun too. And I hope you can see that you can just grab a marking pencil and make it up. You don't have to have some kind of grand plan before you get started. So almost done here with this last little area. And then we can talk about what to do over the tree, the top of the tree. Of course, that's going to be kind of tricky quilting because we're going over all of these half square triangles. But, you know, you have a choice whether you want to quilt that slightly more densely, kind of go more intense with your undulation design, or quilt it more open with as much space as you can manage between those lines of quilting. Again, that trade-off, you know, texture versus density versus speed. So it's all of those things at once. Now, if you notice your lines, your lines of stitching, the size of your stitches getting too big, and you can see some of my stitches are getting just a little bit long, some are a little bit tiny. What that is that speed movement ratio. So what I'm probably doing is moving my hands too fast. I think I'm running my machine at the right speed, but I'm not moving my hands at the right speed with that. So if I'm pushing my hands too fast, what that's going to happen is I'm going to get really big stitches. I can come over here and kind of demonstrate this. So if I'm shoving the quilt block through the machine, look at that, shove, 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 I'm going to get basting stitches basically on the side of that block. So it is a movement and speed ratio that you've always got to keep in your head. And if your stitches start getting big, there's two things you can do. Either slow down your hands and that movement on the quilt, or speed up your machine. Put your foot down, but don't do both at once, because if you do both at once, it's a ratio, your stitches will stay the same size. Okay, so pretty much I'm going to do this exact same shape, basically, that exact same spacing of lines in this other area. So, you know, basically the same thing over here. So I'm going to show you this last area over the tree. My path is going to be to quilt over these half square triangles, down, I'll kind of do like a little dip V, and then come back out the other way. So again, I need to think about, do I want to keep this wider scale, or do I want to bring some of these lines in closer to get that undulation effect? And I gotta say, I love that undulation effect. So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball, and I'm gonna give myself a little bit more space in certain areas. Like, so right here's, I'm widening that out to 1.5 inches out, and that's a-okay. As far as how much quilting your quilt needs, it's all dependent upon your batting. And I'll be honest, I don't need to do anywhere near this much quilting with the batting that I have in the middle of this quilt. This batting allows me quilting up to 8 inches. So I could stitch straight lines 8 inches apart and call it done, you know, or 7 inches apart. You want it within that amount. So understand that this is largely decorative. Okay, that looks good. I think this is the path I'm going to do. I'm going to stay wide. I'm going to dip in just in one little area. Right there, I'm going to dip in that area, and I'm going to dip in that area. And that's going to emphasize that tree shape, I think. It's almost like a weeping willow here. So I think that's going to look really good, and that's going to be my plan from here on out. And remember that speed ratio. I need to make sure to move my hands slowly and gently through that machine. Keep my machine running at a fairly fast speed. And this is the thing that's kind of confusing about free motion quilting, is that you're running your machine fast sometimes. It really depends on how fast you're going, okay? You might not be running your machine fast at all, but the noise of your machine can oftentimes make you want to push the quilt through faster, and that results in big stitches. So you almost have to ignore the sound of the machine, you know, and that can be tricky. You know, whenever we put our foot down, that rev sound really gets us going, and we want to, you know, get moving. So you kind of have to just ignore that. And when you're really going fast, just remember that whatever your machine is doing, you know, you're controlling that with your foot pedal. Well, that's the machine doing its thing, and your hands still need to be making a nice, slow, soft movement. Okay, I'm going to bring this line in, make a nice V. That looks great. And now I'm going to swing out again here, get a nice good distance between those lines, and then I'll aim, kind of reposition, and I'm aiming to dip in again right here, but I'm going to swing out. The wider I space these lines, the less times I have to quilt over the block. And if speed is an issue, then that's an important factor to keep in mind. All right, there we go. Taking out those pins as I go. And now I'm going to swing out nice and wide again. Now let's see if I can do that and follow that same idea, but without marking. And I'm also going to be kind of quilting blind, because right now, as you can see, the whole quilt is behind the machine. So I'm going to be quilting backwards, running towards myself. So let's see if I can do this. I know I want to stay wide. Another thing that I've noticed whenever I quilt backwards is I tend to have bigger stitches because I'm moving my hands a lot faster, so I have to watch out for that. Now I'm bringing those lines in close. Oops, I don't want to bring them in too close. I can't really see what I'm doing. So so there we go. That's looking good. Now I want to widen out that line. I can see now because it's kind of at an angle to the side of the machine. That's great. And now I'm going to swing over and into that depth. Now this is one of the common misconceptions about free motion quilting, and that is that you should never rotate your block around. That free motion quilting means you can quilt in all directions and you should be able to kind of go with the flow and never have to rotate. And that's simply not true. And here's the reason why. When you can't see what you're doing, it's very hard to do the right thing. It's very hard to quilt in the dark or to quilt backwards. You know, I've got pins and needles back here that could hang up my foot and cause really messy stitches. So I can do this because I can see the lines before, and I can do this because I know exactly the space that I'm working in, but I could still get hung up by these pins and pin mores. So whenever you have the opportunity, whenever it feels right, or just simply whenever you can't see what you're doing, give yourself permission to rotate that block around so you can see. So here, stitching to the side, I can get that nice wide spacing, and I think I'm going to curl all the way up into that corner. I think that'll be cool. Again, you can go as wild and crazy with undulation as you like. So this is what I'm going to continue doing from here on out. Very, very simple quilting from here. I'm just going to continue echoing that nice and wide through these areas, dipping down, wide, then coming in nice and close through there and through there. This is going to look different every time you quilt it, but I absolutely love the effect. So that's it for this tutorial. I had so much fun quilting this block with undulation. I absolutely love the effect. And you can see the back of the quilt block, it looks just as good. This is really one of those designs that I think you can use on anything. It's going to end up looking great. And this is such a cool idea of just kind of echoing the shape, you know, and accenting the shape a little bit, and that changed the quilting a little bit. But at the same time, it's also still an all-over design, meaning that we're not really paying attention to that quilting, really, just a little bit. And I think that's perfect. It's fast, it's gorgeous, it adds a nice texture, and it gets the quilt block secured. But of course, you might be wondering about a different design that pays a little bit more attention to the piecing. And I'm going to be sharing a different idea for that on my long arm coming up next week. You can find all of the tutorials and quilt patterns for the Friendship Quilt Along at leahday.com/friendship. It's never too late to join in the fun because the videos will always remain online forever, so you can work at your own pace anytime. So come and check it out at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt. Friendship Quilt Along! I'm such a geek.